Welcome to Sipping Sense, Sips and Swigs, a monthly edutainment podcast designed to introduce you to intriguing and unique people and innovations in the wine world. My name is Stephanie Brown, author of Sipping Sense, Uncorking the Flavors of Wine, Entertaining and Healthy Cooking. And today we have the wonderful opportunity to speak with Stephen Nasiatka.
Hey, you nailed it.
I nailed it. Yes, right. Stephen is a lifelong entrepreneur with over 2 decades of experience spanning finance, accounting, and business leadership. He began his career with the big four accounting firms, held senior finance roles at Siemens, and is the fractional CFO for Firestable, a manufacturing startup focused on innovative and sustainable building materials, where he supports financial strategy and growth initiatives. Today, Stephen is also the founder of StephenUncorked, a premium wine experience company focused on curated tastings, executive wine blending sessions, and custom label programs for corporate, nonprofit, and private clients. His work brings people together through wine in a way that is both engaging and memorable. Now, I met Stephen through his presidency at the Private Directors Association New England chapter. This is a volunteer leadership role centered on advancing board governance and connecting executives and board members across the region. Blending financial expertise with a passion for experience-driven connection, Stephen brings a unique perspective to both business and wine. So welcome, Stephen. It's so great to have you on the show.
Great. Thank you so much and fantastic to be here.
Great. So now, is there anything you want to add to all of that wonderful background I just articulated?
No, I think it's funny, right? Because I think back to even preceding, I guess, my adult life, right? And you mentioned lifelong entrepreneur. And it's funny because even going beyond that, there was ways of bringing two people together in a different way, right? I think I was probably 4 or 5 where I started selling peaches, right? Walking around the neighborhood, selling peaches out of the wagon that grew at my parents' house. And then I think at 5, I graduated to tomatoes. And then from there, created a landscaping company around 8 or 9, which I ultimately gave to my brother. And by the time I was 16, 17, started an eBay business. I was one of the early adopters there, which I pretty much continued that through college and a little bit beyond before starting with the Big Four right out of college. So really, entrepreneurialism has been a huge thing. And in many of those other things, really seeing the other areas of connection. When I was doing the landscaping, it probably wasn't wine, might have been lemonade or Kool-Aid or something like that.
Yes.
But certainly enjoyed getting together with even the clients back then, in the good old days.
Good. Well, being a lifelong entrepreneur, I understand that you get the bug in so many different ways. I have friends that tell me today, how did you think that up? Like, what made you think you were going to do X, Y, Z? Because I love creating experiences like travel experiences, obviously wine and professional experiences for folks that need access. And access to the table is really important today.
Agreed.
So, and that's why the work that you're doing at the Private Directors Association is so important. And the fact that you've actually are focused on how do you bring more women and people of color into that space, I applaud you. So thank you so much for
Absolutely.
doing
Absolutely.
that work. So, okay, we talked about lemonade already. So let's talk about wine. What was the aha moment that made you realize that wine and hospitality should be in your space? I'm assuming it was a passion, and now you have Stephen Uncorked. And when I saw Stephen Uncorked, it made me obviously remember Divas Uncorked on my side of the fence.
Oh, yes.
So tell me a little bit about what flipped the switch for you on that one.
Yeah, I think there wasn't a lightning bolt moment per se. But if I think back, I spent not probably, I spent over 20 years between accounting, finance, Big Four, Siemens, spreadsheets, boardrooms, all those sort of fun things. What I realized is we'd have a number of meetings. We do so many different things. And if I think back to the earliest days of my truly, I guess, professional career, starting at KPMG, really where the magic happened was in the afternoons or in the evenings, right? After you're out of those meetings. And in many cases, back then, it was grabbing a happy hour in Hartford or really just the impromptu type events. And that's where the interesting conversations, that's where, in many cases now, lifelong friendships started. And it wasn't during the daytime, right? It wasn't those meetings in the office. It really was over a good drink or over fantastic food. And I said, you know what, there's really something behind that, right? People are dropping their guard, they're getting more connected. And it's not to say it has to be wine, but frankly, I do feel that wine is one of the best connectors as part of that. And so as I kind of went through my career, very, very early on, like I said, found that as a great tool for business development. I started doing more wine and food gatherings, pulling things together. That got a bit more formally sealed as I probably went another 10, 12 years in. And then it was, joining a couple of international wine and food societies. So one of them is the Chaîne de Rôtisseurs. The other one is the International Wine and Food Society, both of which, again, are international organizations, which really are based on the enjoyer, so the gastronome, but then as well as the culinary aspects as well. So the folks that are the chefs, the sommeliers, the others who are part of that industry. And ultimately, continuing to build that community, bring people together, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. But, at the end of all of that, business still get done, but it was much more in a human way. And for me, it's really not just pouring wine, not just sharing wine, but really creating connections. And so, I would basically say that wine just ends up being the vehicle for the purpose of doing those connections and has been a lot of fun along the way.
You said, a couple of things that really jumped out at me. The whole idea of dropping your guard and how socializing in those settings and gatherings really help people understand who you are.
Hmm.
Values show up, different types of experiences that you've had show up,
Yep.
your hobbies show up, where you can find something that actually really connects you with the person that you're engaging with. And early in your career, was that easy or hard for you? Were you a people person all the time and you could always have conversations with folks? Or even if you have colleagues that struggled with that, did you help them navigate as well? Because I do believe that early in our careers, our confidence is not quite as high as it can get over time. And so
Hmm.
you talked about your journey there. Tell us a little bit more about that journey.
Well, it's funny because actually, if anybody were to know me, call it through high school, I was relatively shy. Like, yes, I'd go in small settings and with my clients at the time, completely social, no issues there. But really, in going to college, one of my big things was how do I kind of expand? How do I get out of my shell? How do I do different things, get interested in different things? And also, it was time of discovery in other ways. Growing up, no knock on my parents, but the average dinner was going to be some sort of potato, either mashed or baked. Nothing fancier than that. Some sort of protein, a few days a week, chicken one, maybe two, and then pork or fish one or two of the rest of the days, right? But really nothing beyond that. And then some sort of vegetable. And that was dinner pretty much every night, back to back. So college was number one, a time of discovery on the food front, and trying different things and going and being adventurous. I actually joined a couple of different clubs, some of which were actually focused on food, others of which were focused on different cultures, different backgrounds, which inherently get you introduced to the food. But really, that was a big part, an important thing for me is to make those steps and to really get out there, put myself out there, which ultimately did very much lend itself to confidence. So as I moved into, my role at KPMG, where, you're talking to controllers, to C-level individuals all the time, having that as a backbone was huge. But then also very quickly learning from the partners, not only in terms of the content, but also in terms of different wines and that sort of thing, which many of them were connoisseurs. That was massively instrumental for development in business development, in conversations, in confidence, in all the things, basically.
Mhm. Great, great. Thank you for that. Because I think a lot of people shy away from being curious in
Hmm.
those particular spaces, and everybody's walking into them wanting to learn. So finding a group that you can do that with is extremely important, especially early in your career.
Yeah, and actually, as I'm thinking through it, I'm just thinking through my circumstance then, right? So that was 2004 or 2000 that I went into college, graduating in 2004. but then how different that would be, were I to be one of the individuals moving into that same stage during COVID, right? And
Right,
how very different that would ultimately be, and how that has impacted many of the people that are younger professionals today, right? It's just a
right.
very different stepping off point. And I do see that, and certainly as I have conversations with some of the younger folks, young professionals, I was just at Babson the other day talking to a number of students. It is interesting to see the old me, the new me, but also to identify like how do I help the young professionals as well to make those steps to kind of get themselves out there and really discover, as you said.
Right, right. Which is what I was talking to you about before we started our conversation today around the whole idea of hospitality intelligence and
Absolutely.
what do you need to learn both from an etiquette perspective as well as exposure perspective in
Hmm.
order to be successful in business because your technical skills alone are not going to get you to over the hump. So you need
Exactly.
both. You need both. And you brought up a good intro into kind of what happened during COVID, where we lost that one-on-one in-person opportunity to dine together.
Yep.
And so now the folks that grew up during that time in college, they're starting a little late in many
Hmm.
cases, and especially if they didn't have that exposure pre-college. And now they got to fast track and get it done because it really is important that you pick your head up out of your phone and
Oh, yes.
actually talk to people today. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the business intersection between the what you do today, what you learned early in your career, and now as the president of the Private Directors Association. Well, first, let's tell the audience what the Private Directors Association is. We know
Sure.
it's about boards and connection, but there are a couple of organizations in the country around board participation and governance. So
Hmm.
let's get a little bit of overview of that. And then let's talk about what do you do as the president of the New England chapter.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so Private Directors Association, there's a number of chapters getting on close to 30 throughout the United States in the realm of 3,000 members. Locally here in the New England chapter, we have right around 150. And the Private Directors Association really is exactly what you said. It's all things governance, and it's improving the quality and caliber of governance throughout privately held or not-for-profit type companies. And so going back to my background, that's always been an interesting area for me. And of course, looking at the number of clients, many of them were publicly held or publicly traded, but a number of them were private. And it was really interesting for me to see the impact of a strong board of directors versus a not strong or even nearly non-existent board of directors. And so I started off, it's a very circuitous, if that's a word, I think it is, path as far as how I got there. But during my journey, I'd actually met an individual named Anthony O'Reilly. Anthony was a British guy who led one of the parts of the CFA or the corporate finance group within Siemens. Got to know him pretty decently well during my time at Siemens. And fast forward a handful of years after I started at a smaller firm after KPMG, probably 2022-ish, realized that he was now living in literally the same town that I was. And so I reached out to him, and I know that he had posted a number of things around Private Directors Association, which I found at least interesting, appealing. You know, reached out, we had a nice coffee together. He shared more details around it, and he ultimately said, well, he said the first time, would you like to get involved? And so I said, well, it sounds interesting. It does tie into not only my goals in learning more about governance and, the potential longer term goal of board service. And also, frankly, for me at that point in time, I was with a company where part of my job and a decent part of my job was business development. And so I looked at the nature of the individuals. I looked at the opportunity to get more involved. And I said, let's do it. Right. So I initially started as a member, then got very heavily involved in the sponsorship committee, utilizing my network there. And then ultimately had the harebrained idea of something that I'd seen before during my time at KPMG that I wanted to do at a smaller firm after I left KPMG, Monomoy Advisors, that I didn't really get off the ground there. But I said, let's do a capital summit and symposium. Anthony said, let's do it. That sounds a great idea. Went out, raised a bunch of funds, had some great sponsors. We ended up having a 80-ish person symposium with Nasdaq Private Market, Ernst& Young, Kirkland Ellis, and a number of others, Winston and Strawn, and really just a bunch of great companies. And it was talking about the different ways to raise capital, of course, IPO being one of those, but getting into the other vehicles as well. And for me, that was a tremendous amount of effort to pull that together. And I said, I like the organization. I like where this is going. Let's have a conversation with the then president. And at that point in time, he separated our responsibilities, took a co-president role until January 1st of this year, which I took on as full president. And what's been a lot of fun for me, of course, as president, you kind of look at the major areas, whether it be programming, sponsorship, partnership, as well as membership, and really have a lot of impact in driving all of those areas. And that is really what I've been focused on is, to your other point, really how do you make it interesting? How do you make it inclusive? How do you bring in a lot of different ideas? One of the comments that Pradeep, who is my head of sponsorship, said, he's like, I keep on coming to you with these crazy ideas, and you keep on saying yes. So, and I said, hey, crazy if it is applicable and could be interesting and relevant to the group, and is kind of satisfying personal goals, the goals of the organization, etc., completely makes sense, and let's do it.
You're right. Well, we always have wine there, so that's a good thing.
There is always wine, and there's always good wine because at the end of the
Yes.
day, where there is wine, there's magic, right?
Correct. Okay, so I'm gonna pivot back to wine. Let's talk about actually two things. One
Sure.
is a memorable moment around a glass of wine. I know you have the ability to actually sell wine, so let's talk about a little bit how you got involved in that. And then we'll finish up with what do you want the people who are going to listen to this take away and how do they find you? Memorable glass of wine.
I was going to say that's a lot of questions. You got to bring it back to the
I
individual.
will. I'll promise you.
All
Don't
right,
worry.
good, good, good. And I haven't started drinking it. Maybe that's a problem. No, so memorable glass of wine. It's interesting. Have you watched Drops of God?
Yes, I watched the first season and I thought the first season was amazing. I'm having a little trouble getting into the second season, but yes, I have. I do try to watch all of the movies that are about wine in some form or fashion.
So it's interesting. One of the quotes, and I wish I had it out so I'd memorize it better, or could repeat it better than I probably will do it justice. But one of the quotes in there was basically where the younger versions of the main character, of the parents, were sitting together. And basically the conversation was along the lines of, here we are today, but 10, 20, 30 years down the road, you're going to remember this moment, this glass. And it went into a bit of other things around that. But the reality is, it is true, right? I can't think of many times where I have that memorable beer or that memorable other drink, but I can absolutely think back to a number of times, whether it be first dates, whether it be, I'll never forget when I was at KPMG very early on, and I had a 1982 Chateau Margaux, right? So my birth year, and just truly phenomenal wine at the Tavern on the Green in New York. And I can, to this day, envision the exact weather, the people that I was with, all those sort of things. It really is one of those things that it just brings out the emotions. And as a result of that, it really kind of stores itself in your brain,
Mhm,
and really can linger on long after that glass has happened.
mhm,
It's funny, I was probably 2 years ago in Napa, and there's a lot of different discovery mechanisms in terms of what wineries I visit. Of course, there's always your favorites. In my case, there's ones that I represent, there's ones that I'd like to represent, right? So those are more on the business side. And then in other cases, it's, let's just drive around, or if I'm, being in car service, ask for recommendations. And this one time I said, let's try the Yelp approach. And so the winery that I ended up finding was called Arns. And interestingly enough, Irons, as I called them, she said, "Yeah, we're not at the location anymore. Unfortunately, it was burned. It was one of the ones that got hit by fire."
wow.
But ultimately, end up having phenomenal tasting. It was her and her husband. It was just a beautiful setting at her home instead of the winery, which of course is no longer there. And I ordered the wines. They came later, and it was just a beautiful, I think it was a 2013 or 14 Cabernet, and it gets shipped back, signed by the winemaker in a gold pen, and just it brings you exactly back to that moment there, having the conversation, meeting the winery dog, all those sort of things. But I have countless stories like that where I can remember that and exactly what I was experiencing, how I felt, the environment, the people, you name it. In many other cases, deals that were done and closed. Some of them that are confidential that I can't talk about, right? But it really is and has been an amazing mechanism for just incredible times and memorable times.
Yeah. And you describing what you just described brought back so many memories in my head about moments where I'm going like, oh wow, that's why I love this business. That's why I love this space. That's why it's such a passion for how I entertain and share those moments with other folks.
Yeah, and actually, so I'd be remiss not to. I think maybe part of that question or your second question is how I got into wine specifically from a selling perspective. And so that was interesting because I was working for a smaller firm in Newton at that point in time, and I was invited to a wine tasting. And, you know, I won't say that I've never met a wine tasting that I don't like because there have been some that have been less than fantastic in terms of the caliber of the wine.
Mhm.
Although those are in some cases equally or more memorable than some of the average wine tastings, right?
Right.
But so it was one of those ones that I said, all right, I'm happy to join and I look forward to it. And what ended up being the case is I went to the person's home in Lancaster, Mass, and was greeted by a sparkling Cremant de Bourgogne, and it was a rosé titled the number 69. It was a beautiful wine, just perfect on the acidity and just fantastic across the board. And so I'm enjoying that and proceeded into the wine tasting, which was five or six other wines. And across the board, they're great quality and great quality for the price. And those are the wineries under the Boisset portfolio, which is quite a few wineries. Folks may know Buena Vista or Deloche, Elizabeth Spencer, Raymond in France, Domaine de la Vougerie or Bouchard. And there's another 20 or so brands after that. But the woman who hosted, Eileen, she went through and said, well, what do you think? And I was looking at the price point. I said, this is incredible. That's Cremant for $30 is something that drinks like a bottle that's double the price. And then the other wines were anywhere from 20 to $100 or whatever they were. But everything across the board being fantastic quality price ratio. So that was kind of my start into it because I said, well, this is great. I'm doing a ton of business development stuff anyways. I personally enjoy wine. This couldn't be better. Like, let's get into the business. And so
Right.
that's exactly what I did at that point in time. I've subsequently expanded into other areas. But talking about number one, a very incredible, memorable time with wine, with specific wines, the fact that I remember exactly what that one was, and I could actually remember probably three out of the other six that I had. There's not a lot of other things that happened, 2, 3 years ago that you can remember with that specificity.
Yes, yes. So back in my diva days, we were lucky enough to have him actually facilitate a wine dinner on
Oh,
Martha's
wow.
Vineyard. And I did some work with Gallo over the years. And I call the marriage of the two was an amazing accomplishment, making one of the biggest wine conglomerate in the world. But the wines were always wonderful. And we did Chateauneuf de Pop that for that wine dinner, which he's very much known for. And
Yep.
so that was very interesting to have him actually show up and be there and
He
facilitate.
is a truly dynamic, incredible presenter, right? And
Yes.
there's nobody
Very
more passionate
charming, very
about wine.
charming.
Charming, passionate, all the things, yes.
Right. Well, good. So your name is Stephen Uncorked. What is his program called?
Well, so ultimately, from a Stephen Uncorked perspective, I'll go down a couple of quick paths. So certainly, I have a number of wine clubs that are with producers throughout California, France, Italy is one of the more recent additions. And broadly speaking, almost all of the products in the portfolio are those that have a heavy focus on sustainability, organic farming practices. That's something that's important to me. And, I can't go on record and say that wine is good for you because there's a lot of studies. Some say some things and other things.
Right.
But I can certainly say that as is especially important to today's consumers, that the wines that I represent are absolutely less bad than some of the others, right? It's not bringing in the pesticides, herbicides that unfortunately many of the California producers are known for. So that's a big important part. A big part of what I do as well is around corporate events or private events. And so in many cases, there's kind of a cross between those because I also support a lot of not-for-profits in what I do. And
Mhm.
so, for example, on the corporate side, anything from a wine tasting to a pop-up wine tasting setup. So think about I did this in New York City for a law firm where they had 150 plus people. And yes, you have your standard bar, you have the other things, but off to the side, well, I would say relatively front and center because I wanted people to actually enjoy the wines, was my setup. And so I had, in that case, I actually ate at the Boisset wines. And people absolutely loved it, right? They come up, and in some cases, they just wanted to grab a glass, they want to try something different. In other cases, right, people were lined up and they're like, all right, I'm on number four, I'm on number five. And it was just fun seeing the attorneys and alumni folks there just having a great time.
Right.
The other thing that I do that is probably my favorite experience to do is wine blending. And, the sommelier at Boisset used to call it finger painting for adults, which, funny enough, is exactly the same that one of my clients had said. They're like, this is literally finger painting for adults, which
Uh-huh.
then they basically stole my tagline. But, you have the five Bordeaux varietals, and utilizing those in many of those cases, I start out the session by saying, this is not going to be your typical wine tasting. This is an executive decision-making experience. Because if you think about it, and you know your Bordeaux as well, you have 1%, 2% of Petit Verdot. And somebody's going to ask, well, why would you have 1 or 2%? Like, that's kind of silly, right? And the reason for that is, and as people go through and do the experience, that 1 or 2% can have a dramatic difference on your end blend. And people are not expecting that. And then, of course, there's the million tie-ins to that 1% incremental effort and what that does on what your output is or how your outcomes are, those sort of things. So there's a million different ways, of course, to tie it in. But at the end of the experience, everybody just has a really good time. And the last one of the guys at the last one basically said, "Hey, you called it finger painting for adults, but this is a lot better than finger painting." I've been to other cases or other events where, for example, and I won't mention the name of the organizer, but it was a very high ticket price, and the entertainment was great, the food was fantastic, the venue is beautiful, overlooking the ocean, etc. And it turned out that the approach for wine procurement for that was to go to Trader Joe's and keep it in the $10 range. So completely off brand with the rest of the experience. I
Right.
actually saw four wines there that I was excited I had never seen before. And I actually asked them to try all four of them because I had not seen them before. And it was really, and you're not supposed to disparage other wines. I'm not saying any brands, that sort of thing, but it really was bad, average, okay, undrinkable type of thing.
Yes, no, I hear you because when people are doing receptions for senior folks who probably have pretty exposed palates, they may not know what they're drinking for 9% of the time, but
Yep.
they've had a lot of great stuff. You don't want to pick a wine that everybody under the sun has had before. You can find a good bottle of wine for 30 bucks.
Hmm.
But you have to know what you're picking and where you're picking it from. And most of the people who follow me nowadays are looking for the story behind the wine.
Exactly.
What is
Exactly.
the story behind the wine? How did the winemaker get into the business? What are they thinking about? Like you talked about the environment. Are they paying attention to what's going in the bottle so that they get the best the
100%.
winemaker wants to use that experience out of that bottle of wine? I'd love to do an event with you, and we're going to figure
Yeah.
that out
Let's
because
do it.
let's do it. And then I think let's close with a little bit of, well, what's next for Stephen Uncorked over the next couple of years, and make sure people know how to find you.
Well, before I do that, I'm going to ask you a question, right? So
Okay.
it's Friday night. It's pretty nice weather outside here in the Boston area. What's in your glass tonight?
Ooh. So I'm not going to give you a brand name, but I'll
Oh,
give
that's
you
okay.
two. I'll give you two varietals I really love. I love Alicote out of the Burgundy region, primarily because in my head it's kind of a cross between Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc.
Yep.
And I love Chardonnay, but you get tired of it. And Sauvignon Blanc, I only really like with food.
Hmm.
So if you put the two of them together in my head on my palate, really I can drink it anytime and I can have food with it anytime. And a lot of people haven't had it before, so I try to give people different whites because sometimes the only white that comes to their mind is either Riesling, Chardonnay, or Pinot Grigio, and there are thousands of other ones. So that's my white.
Absolutely.
And my red, that's hard for me. So I love Zinfandel, red Zinfandel, and I like it from all over the world. So
Hmm.
probably say that would be my first pick. And then my second pick would be a Merlot forward Bordeaux.
Okay. All right.
I
Interesting.
really love Bordeaux. So yeah, so those are kind of a go-to.
Very good.
You, you can find all three of those in all price points. You can go
Absolutely.
crazy or you can go good. I had a chance to go to Margot this past summer, and that was amazing just to stand in front of the Chateau Margaux
Oh, yes, absolutely.
gate and take the picture. We didn't get a chance to go inside, but we drank a lot of Margot vineyard wines while we were there.
Yeah, that is definitely an area where you can go pretty crazy on the spectrum of price points for
Yeah,
sure.
so that's my wine.
All right, very cool. So I'll answer your question, then I'll talk a little bit about that one question too. So yeah, so what's next for Stephen Uncorked? It's been interesting. I've done a number of events throughout the United States, and it's been great. I've had some repeat customers, especially on the corporate side, which I love to see. And it's fun when, for example, the one firm I mentioned before, I've done now two events for them in Boston. I've done one event for them in New York City. And start to see the same people that are like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're back here again because the wine is always really good. And so that's obviously good to hear. So it means
It's the best compliment you can get.
it means I'm actually, hopefully doing my what I'm expected to do, yes. But then more fun what's come out of that is getting invited to actually do very important celebrations for example, the managing partner's family. So he had me do a milestone birthday, and I'm continuing to get more of those sort of things. So it's one thing on a corporate perspective, especially what I try to do is really make it easy for the organizer to have a great event. But when you start getting invited in front of people's families and that sort of thing, that's a whole different level of trust,
Right,
which is
right,
awesome to say. So it is really continuing to expand on the corporate side, enjoying the private events like that as well. And then I would say more broadly, continuing to evaluate which wineries make sense. So most recently, I've taken on an ambassador role with Dry Creek Winery or Dry Creek Vineyard out of Healdsburg. And I was out there in, I believe, February, and I was just beyond impressed with the caliber of their wines, especially with the price point. You mentioned Zinfandel. If they have 30-ish current release, about 10 of those are different types of Zins. And most of them in the 40, 50, $60 price point, which they punch well above that price point. And so that's really what's next. It's continuing to figure out what makes sense, what partnerships make sense to continue to build the brand, especially locally. I love the corporate stuff. I love the big settings, but some of my favorites really are the 12, 14 people sitting around the table doing a wine dinner, doing interesting things with that. I've had dinners before where I did a sparkling wine and a still wine with every course, which I don't think I've ever seen that before. And then I've also had a couple of cases where when I'll do certain dishes, I'll pair a white and a red with that course versus just doing the standard one wine per course. And
right,
just from a discovery perspective, always interesting. And oftentimes somebody says, you know what, I really don't love the white, I love the red, or vice versa. But then when they have it with the food, they're like, you know what, I actually like them equal, or I like the other one better. And that's just a lot of fun. And people are not
right,
expecting
right,
that kind of outcome.
right. In my book and the recipe part of my book, I give everybody a red and a white to go with the recipe simply for that specific reason is that sometimes people have a preference.
Yep,
But I always say experiment because you never know what you're going to get
absolutely.
when it pairs with the food. And I've been able to actually convert a few red wine only drinkers to,
Yep,
at least try out some of the whites that the non-traditional whites so that they actually have better opportunity to pair when they're hosting. And my goal for folks is just be creative when you're hosting. And the only way you
absolutely.
can actually know how to be creative is that you try them yourself.
You got to
Uh,
give it a whirl. I'll be super quick on this because I know we're running out of time here. But it was funny because last weekend I was invited over to a friend's home, and it was Indian food, which can be interesting from a pairing perspective, right? So what was fascinating there is one of the women who's at the event, she was exactly like you just said, right? I don't normally drink, like it's pretty much whites. I enjoy my whites, and I love the Sauv Blanc that you brought from Dry Creek. I'm going to drink that. I'm going to enjoy that, and thank you. And I said, well, I also have this interesting Pinot Noir. Just give it a whirl. And so I won't mention the names on that, but really interesting Pinot Noir, a bit a higher end one. And she's like, this is incredible. And then, it's always nice when they ask for the second glass. And so then to round it out, I brought a Cabernet. And the Cabernet was one of the ones that I mentioned before from Arns, but I think it was a 2016. And fascinating there because she said the same thing. She's like, this is really good. Well, yeah, I think I have a convert.
yeah, no,
It's exciting.
It's exciting to see those wheels turn in people's heads when they go like, I always say to my friends, don't ever say you don't like.
Hmm.
Just say I haven't experienced one that made me go back again.
Yep,
Because you
absolutely.
never know exactly when you're going to have that one that says, oh, I'm a convert now, and I'm going to try a lot more.
Well, hey, my thing is you have two hands, right?
Yes.
Two hands, you have room for two glasses. And so why not try two varietals side by side? For I've had cases before which it is so fun to open up, have a group of people over, and especially if folks are coming over and staying for the weekend, right? Open up 5 or 6 bottles of wine. Have fun with them. Try
Yeah.
them again a day later, right? Try them side by side. Get the two glasses per person. Set up a lineup. Whatever it is, you don't have to pound them. You don't have to, it's not about getting drunk. It really is about enjoying them. And so, what if you have 6 different wines, or 8 different wines, or 10 different wines that night? Again, if you're doing 1 ounce pours, 2 ounce pours, you're not getting intoxicated, but you really are coming back to your word before, which I love, is discovering.
Right. Well, some of the training that I'm trying to do with some of my newbies with in the hospitality intelligence space is really training them in that way, have multiple types of wine with a
Hmm.
dinner. Because when you start to experience fine dining, that's what's going to happen. You're going to walk up to your table setting and there are going to be multiple glasses. And the multiple glasses are because you're going to try different things with different courses. And so you need to learn how to navigate that when you're dining with a group of people.
It's
I
all
always
fun.
say this is all about having fun and experiences. And once you kind of end up knowing the, I'll call quote unquote, etiquette around it all, then you'll be confident and you'll just forget about navigating and you just have a lot of fun.
Yeah, I know what you were saying with the hospitality course. That sounds like a fantastic offering that I expect ends up being very, very well received because that's an area that, unfortunately, wine is very frightening for many people. And it shouldn't be, right? It should be fun. It should be enjoyable and, the demystified at the end.
Correct, correct. Well, thank you so much for spending this hour with me. I really, really appreciate it. Before the summer's out, I'm going to have you and some of my folks and some of your folks in the same room together.
Do it.
Thank you to my listeners. Make sure you sign up for my weekly emails where I share recipes and monthly wine picks and information about upcoming events and trips with industry leaders. That's sippingsense.com, all one word, sippingsense.com. And for this podcast, Sips and Swigs, please follow it on Spotify. That will help others find me online. And until next month, stay safe and stay strong. If you want to know more about Stephen Nasiatka, go to StephenUncorked.wine. That's StephenUncorked.wine. Or to find out more about the Private Directors Association, go to privatedirectors.org and find your chapter.